This video is brought to you by Squarespace. During the 1900s, it seemed like the whole world was sipping that sweet communist Kool-Aid. But you see, despite Britain never having a communist revolution, it didn't stop the boys from trying until they were old, grey and tired. From secret fundings from Moscow, members of parliament being imprisoned, their newspaper being banned and even convictions of spying, today we will tell the story of Britain's failed communist revolution.
We communists are fighting for a new Britain. We want a government to organise speedy victory over Japan, security for war, and an unswerving alliance with the Soviet Union. Forward to a new and happier Britain.
Some basic facts about your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm a communist, you idiot.
So communism, how we know it today, is slightly different than it was in the early 1900s.
I'm really stupid. Can you educate me a little bit on Marxism? I don't know what it is for real.
It wasn't always Twitch streamers wearing Gucci and arguing from their mansions. In the early days, it was just the boys taking a little look around at society and going, well, you are living in a palace. I'm living in squalor. How about we just sort of share a little bit, if that's okay with you, my lord? All the gulags, the famines, the wars, the suppression of people's rights, that was the small print. You know, no one read that. That was the T's and C's. The reason I say all that is because you can't look at this story how we see communism now. We know how it played out. It got a little messy, but back then, no one knew that. So I want you to look at this with the wide-eyed optimism as those early communists did. And there was one big moment that would really define communism, and that was the Russian Revolution.
It was a country in which workers and peasants lived in poverty and hardship, while Russia's elite, its imperial family and aristocracy, lived lives of gilded luxury.
You're probably aware that in the 1800s and 1900s, life for your average pleb was a bit shit. There was a lot of hard manual labor. You know, you were making things, carrying heavy things, whacking things with other heavy things. Life wasn't easy. You were getting paid pennies and you lived in bad conditions. Yes, I'm talking piss and poo. But because the wealthy of society were getting so wealthy in this time, the working class, they felt a bit hard done by. So this was the norm for this era. This was most of the world. You had your rich boys just dancing on their piles of money, and then you had your poor boys, and they weren't dancing on piles of money. So what started happening specifically in Britain was that we started to form a labour movement. They started to meet up in rooms and go, this sucks. And everyone would go, yeah, it does. Slowly, these boys got more and more organised, and they would make political pressure. You know, they would demand better working conditions, less hours, more pay, and ever so slowly and patiently, they would push for change politically, asking for laws that helped them, influencing parliament through democracy. And Russia saw that and went, why don't we just kill the rich? The Russian Revolution was a madness. It was a crazy period of time because there were revolutions of peasants in the past. In 1848, all around Europe, there was tons of peasant revolutions. Even Britain tried to have a revolution. Obviously, there was rain, so everyone just went, it's not worth it. All of these peasant revolutions in the past tended to make the country worse than it was before. They basically replaced one tyrannical dictatorship with another. But in the Russian Revolution of 1917, something different happened. It actually worked. And there was two bros who were really them big think boys, and that was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Because of the failures of the previous revolutions, they realized that just replacing the leadership doesn't work. The nature of power and ruling tends to lead to tyranny, or that's how they saw it. So they said, what about we get rid of ruling completely? There's no leaders, there's no rulers. They presented a new idea, like a new structure to society, which was called, you guessed it, communism, where they believed that the working class, the proletariat, could just rule itself, you know? Barry's organised a couple football games and everyone seemed to enjoy that, so let's just give him the country. The Russian people were just lapping up Marx. They loved it. Yes, brother. Communism. And so one thing led to another, and now all the ruling class and the aristocracy are dead. And so these revolutionaries, known as the Bolsheviks, as they stood there in their blood-soaked ashonkers, they looked around and went, hang on a second, lads. We actually fucking did it. It was wild. You can't say it wasn't impressive that they managed to do this. And so when the Russian revolutions came to an end, the rest of the world started looking at them and going, we could probably do the same thing. And so from here, more and more communist movements would start popping up, and one of them being the Communist Party of Great Britain. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the #1 platform for building your own beautiful, perfect website. There's a load of new tools, including Squarespace's Blueprint AI and SEO tools. The AI can basically design the website to be completely unique to what it is you do. And the optimized SEO tools are going to help you appear much higher in search results. Also, Squarespace are now offering flexible payments. That means you can pay with PayPal, Apple Pay, and loads of others. And in some countries, you can even do buy now and pay later using Afterpay and ClearPay. And then for me, the most exciting part is the Squarespace AI, where you can basically put in a prompt, ask it to do the copyright for your website, and then you can just tweak it to fit exactly how you want it. It's really good for doing your product descriptions and all that sort of stuff, especially if you've got lots of different products. It will just save you time. So be sure to head over to squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant, and to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. Anyway, back to the video. The CPGB started on the 31st of July 1920. At this point in Britain, we already had a very well organized labor movement. They were unionizing different trade groups, having strikes, walkouts, etc. And they were getting more and more political representation. It was made up of lots of different groups, but they really came together and made a home in the Labour Party, which started in the year 1900. And it was growing pretty fast. You know, it was getting a lot more power, and it was making positive changes for the lives of the working class. But like any group, you always have them edgy bruhs. I'm talking about them boys that are just too cool for school. And so, of course, there were some people that thought Labour was too vanilla. And so when the Labour Party were saying things like, how about you pay us a bit more money? Or maybe you make it safer at work so I don't lose my arm in a machine. And then you'd have that one communist guy in the background going, yeah, and what about we cut all the rich people's heads off?
You can do it! Cut his fucking head off!
The Communist Party in Britain was created in 1920 by workers who faced class warfare in the factories, mines, mills and shipyards, on the railways and the docks.
Their aim was to overthrow capitalism and construct a socialist society free from exploitation and oppression.
The Communist Party in Britain, let's be honest, it was like a USSR fan club. You know, they had the merch, they loved the symbols, the posters in their bedroom. It was like a knockoff, you know, it's like when you go on holiday in Tenerife and there's a British pub. And in their very first document, in their first announcement, you can see how aligned they are with Moscow. They published Towards the Revolution, Our Policy. The document's pretty vague. Like, again, they don't really mention gulags and stuff like that that's coming down the pipeline. It's more just, you know, nice sounding stuff. But what they do make clear is their allegiance to Moscow. They say, the Communist Party is to the Republic of Russia flesh of its flesh and bone of its bone. Stephen, why are you talking like that? What's gotten into you? This is kind of awkward timing because Russia is having a civil war. There's two armies. There's the Red Army, which is like the communists, and then you have the Allied White Army. And if you were to guess which side Britain is sending troops and supporting, well, I'll give you a hint. It wasn't the Red Army. And you might be thinking, why was Britain so opposed to this? Surely, like, whatever's happening in Russia, let them deal with it. But to be honest, it wasn't as simple as that. They set up a body called the Communist International, or the comintern. And this was controlled by the Soviet Union, and it was very clear that it wanted global communism. And so have a little guess as to who was a member of this organization, the CPGB. In May 1920, a movement had grown called Hands Off Russia, which was led by, surprise, surprise, the Communist Party of Great Britain. And so there was this boat called the SS Jolly George, which it's an ironic name for a boat handling weapons. And this was Britain shipping weapons over to Poland to try and defend itself against Soviet Russia. The dock workers who would have loaded the ship saw this arms crate, and very quickly they just happened to receive a message saying, we will give you full union support if you refuse to send these weapons to Poland. And that's what they did. This was a massive moment. It was led by the CPGB, and it showed that a union group of workers could undermine the British authority. This was pretty worrying. And there was one very important man behind the Hands Off Russia campaign, and that was Harry Pollitt.
It is said that the obstacle to peace is the policy of the Soviet Union. This is the greatest lie of our time. No nation in the world desires a lasting peace more than the Soviet Union.
So when the Soviet Union saw this absolute banger from old Hazza, they were chuffed. They were very impressed. He even got his own cute little stamp with his face on in the Soviet Union. That's a big deal. Harry Pollitt is probably one of the most famous British communist leaders that ever existed. If anyone could have been Stalin, Mao, or Lenin in Britain, it was probably Harry Pollitt. And like every future dictator, they always have their childhood trauma, you know, their dark backstory that leads them down this route. Harry grew up very poor. He had a bunch of siblings and like 3 of them died in infancy, and it'd really be the death of his youngest sister that would fuck him up. On top of that, his mum was like working hard labor her whole life. Harry started working at 12 and he worked alongside her, and he saw how work just completely destroyed her. So it might not be a shocker that Harry didn't love capitalism. He didn't think this system was very fair. And when he heard about the Russian revolutions, he went, oh boy, that is some good news. So Pollitt got active, you know, he started becoming a political geezer, and he joined the CPGB in its early days in 1920. He was one of the key members. And 1 year later, he packed his fluffiest schuber he could get his hands on, and he went over to the Soviet Union. And he signed up for the VIP meet and greet, and he actually met Lenin, an experience that he would later describe as the greatest day of his life.
I'll never wash this flipper again.
But you see, going to the enemy of the nation that your country's at war with to hang out with its leader, that decision wasn't going to make Harry Pollitt's life very easy.
Communism is a religion. It is anti-Christian, it is retrograde, it is immoral.
All right, so when the Russian Revolution happened, here in Britain, we obviously had some of the similar conditions that led to it. And the British government looked around and said, don't get any fucking ideas, lads. That's not happening here. When Britain chose to support the Allied White Army, it also made a commitment to rooting out communism within Britain. Ever since the beginning of the CPGB in 1920, the MI5 went on a bit of a campaign of spying. And by bit, I mean, it was like the most recorded spying of a party that's ever happened in Britain. They would wiretap their meetings and their buildings. They would intercept all communications from the CPGB and Moscow, as well as any communications with the Communist International. In this time, if a communist farted, there would be an MI5 agent on the other end of the wire taking a note of it. There was even internal conversations whether to revoke passports from members of the Communist Party in Britain. But you see, it would be the interception of one letter that would absolutely change everything. The Zinoviev letter.
A very secret letter of instruction from Moscow, which we publish below, discloses a great Bolshevik plot to paralyze the British Army and Navy and to plunge the country into civil war.
In October of 1924, the Daily Mail published a letter that they claimed that they had intercepted from a leading Bolshevik leader called Grigory Zinoviev to the British communists. Where basically it said, what are you waiting for, lads? The revolution's already begun. Get your sickles out. And just, you know, coincidentally, this letter was published 4 days before a general election. And like, look, the CPGB, they didn't stand a chance of winning in this election, but that wasn't the point. It was mainly used so that the Conservatives could blast Labour. They would use it to smear the Labour leader, Ramsay MacDonald, saying that he planned to lend money to Russia. The Tories were very anti-communist, and they used this letter as proof that there was a lurking communist revolution just around the corner. Jeremy, come here quick, I see one. What is it? It's a communist. Where? Over there, look. Oh wait, no, it's a squirrel. You see, the Conservative establishment was very skeptical of this whole workers' rights thing. And at this time, Labour had just had its first ever term in office, which was in January of 1924 under Ramsay MacDonald. But they were a weak minority government, and the working man had only just got the right to vote in 1918. The Labour movement was more made up of like workers' rights, like trade unions, maybe a couple of socialists sprinkled in here and there. And also, for sure, there were some communists. I'm not pretending there wasn't, but it seems that most of the Labour Party wanted to reform capitalism and not like overthrow it with a bloody revolution. But it was true that Ramsay MacDonald was open to working with Russia, having open trade with the Soviet Union, etc. And so this line of attack was very strong from the Conservatives.
If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist.
The Conservatives would really take any opportunity to point out the influence of communism in Britain. If you were eating a sandwich and your tomato was too red, you know, they would start getting suspicious. Well, on top of this letter, there was also the Campbell case. The Campbell case was where the communist John Ross Campbell wrote an article calling for the troops not to fire at workers and instead fire at the exploiters and the capitalists. But Labour decided not to prosecute him. They withdrew the prosecution due to pressure from Labour backbenchers. So it was true, there was definitely some influence in the Labour Party from the communists. After all these dramas, etc., Ramsay MacDonald actually decided to dissolve the government after just 9 months, leading to another general election in 1924. The same election that the Zinoviev letter was published 4 days before. Labour lost the election. And people speculate over what caused them to lose, etc. But either way, it would turn out in 1999 that the Zinoviev letter was fake. It was said to be a forgery by none other than an MI6 agent who then leaked it to the Conservative Party. But the facts didn't matter. The war against communism grew and grew. MI6 ramped up surveillance. And now not only the Conservatives, but also the Labour Party were very suspicious of communists and the CPGB. And, fair enough. Labour looked at the CPGB and were like, lads, you fucked it. We just started getting some power and you couldn't help yourself but call for a violent revolution. And so Labour moved to completely ban any communist member from the Labour Party. Just a year after the Campbell case was dismissed, a brand new, more damning case was created that landed 12 members of the CPGB, top members, including Harry Pollitt, to be on trial for inciting mutiny, for writing in their newspaper that the military should resist orders, and if they have to shoot, don't shoot the workers. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. It was an 8-day trial at the Old Bailey. It was a big deal. A variety of sentences were handed out, but Pollitt received 1 year in prison. The first 5 years of the CPGB could be described as a bit of a bumpy start. For the establishment and the ruling class, this was great news, obviously. I would say I don't think the establishment were really that scared of a communist revolution in England. I don't think we're in the same exact scenario as Russia was. But more so, it was about using these radicals, these extremists, as a way to slow down the legit labour movement and to try and hold on to this very unequal society that existed at the time. It still exists, but that's another video. And this idealism from the CPGB, this purity of, it's revolution or nothing. It was just a poison to the cause. It wasn't helping anyone. From the jump, the CPGB were struggling to hide their authoritarian tendencies. Communism is meant to be about, the people, man. Get all the bros together, we'll all decide, we'll make a perfect world for everyone, democracy, yada, yada, yada. But you see, they later realised that, people are idiots. They don't know what's best for them. Only us super cool level 99 communists know what's good for the people. And this was following what the Soviet Union believed. And it's this hypocritical thought that in order for us to get rid of hierarchy and install democracy, we must have our own hierarchy and have no democracy. Huh? Either way, the party still grew. It had 4,000 members. And it even had a couple of MPs in office. But you see, there would be one major moment. There would be the biggest moment in the CPGB's history. And that was the general strike in 1926.
On the 4th of May 1926, a 9-day general strike of 1.7 million workers began in the United Kingdom.
I've touched on the relationship between the CPGB and the trade unions. They were running duos together. They loved each other. And it was quite clever because the CPGB was able to skirt around democracy to gain influence in the country via the unions. Ultimately, if a group of workers decide, hang on a second, our boss is paying us shit, we could just not work. And then he doesn't earn money as well as us. It doesn't make a difference for us because we're earning no money anyway. This would force the hand of the boss. He would have to do something. But this wasn't a new thing. This tug of war between trade unions and the government was a long battle. For a very long time, having unions was completely illegal. But it would be in 1906 with the Trade Dispute Act, which made it so that trade unions and strikers can't be held liable and sued for damages that might occur from striking. This was their get out of jail free card. And so on the 4th of May 1926, the TUC, they called for a strike. This strike lasts 9 days and involved 1.7 million people. Despite being a dispute in the coal industry, it wasn't just the miners striking. Workers from all different sectors decided to work together to strike on behalf of the coal industry, bring the country to its knees so that they have to pay the people more. Stanley Baldwin, who was the PM at the time, he went shit. He declared a state of emergency, mobilised troops. The British Army came in to protect lorries. There was vehicles attacked and smashed, etc. There was even a train derailed. I don't know how the hell they managed that. But the general strike had to come to an end because of a judge, Mr. Astbury. But basically, he ruled that all of these strikes weren't protected under the 1906 law other than the coal one. You can't just strike about what's happening to someone else. And so the trade unions could be held liable and could be sued by the employer. And so they got scared. May 12th, they called off the strike and achieved nothing, basically.
The general strike collapsed after 9 days, but the coalfields were idle as the miners carried on alone.
And like, in my opinion, if Britain ever came close to a communist revolution, it was the general strike. I think that was their moment, and they didn't take it. It was crazy. Like, if you think about it, it showed what people could do if they banded together under an ideology. Literally, the boys brought the country to a standstill. This is that moment in a film where you killed someone and you're staring at your hands thinking, oh, I have so much power. After the strikes, the CPGB grew enormously.
The general strike has its origins in the British coal mining industry, which was facing increasing competition from foreign producers and a strong pound that made exports prohibitively expensive.
Basically, a lot can be tied to World War I. Like, if you think about this coal problem and the fact that the workers were being paid shit, from the Marxist-Lenin communist perspective, which the CPGB followed to the T, they would see World War I as nothing more than an imperialist war between capitalists. The strike that happened was 8 years after the end of World War I. A war where an insane number of working class men were sent to die in these awful conditions of trench warfare based on the decisions from the ruling class. On top of that, the coal industry was affected by World War I as it depleted our coal resource. Because we were exporting coal less during World War I, other countries were able to fill in that gap, like America, Poland, Germany, etc. And so a very strong anti-establishment sentiment grew. After the strike, the membership to the CPGB doubled to 10,000 members. The mid-1920s was a strong moment, and then, in true CPGB style, it got pretty bumpy again. The third period.
The revolution was appealing because it demanded, above all else, the willingness of the people. If you want, you can.
Communist International loved sort of dropping updates. They loved a new policy. Second period's over, mate. We're on third period now. Third period. The third period was a rejection to like democratic, reformist attitudes. You can't ask for your rights. You got to take them. Effectively, it was give me bloody revolution or give me death. This was in a time of the Great Depression, right? This is a bad period of time. And so you would think the sympathies for communism would be at an all-time high. However, post-strike, which was a big moment for the CPGB's popularity, between 1929 and 1932, communist support in Britain collapsed. And this was because of the third period. What I think happened was that the CPGB, instead of looking at its own country and going, well, perhaps we're a little bit different to Russia, that has zero history of democracy ever, whereas we've had it for a while now, perhaps telling everyone that a bloody revolution is needed, no time for democracy, and it will be led by us elite level 99 communists, maybe in Britain, that might not sell as well as it does in Russia. No, the CPGB went full alignment with the USSR, of course, as it always does. And so they started to turn on their own boys. They started to see anyone that wasn't a communist as a fascist. That included Labour, which was most of the working class. There was no attitude of compromise. It was just this dictatorship. It's our way, or go fuck yourself. And on top of this, the third period meant that the CPGB could no longer influence trade unions, like in the passive way. So instead, they had to make their own rival trade unions that were radical communist trade unions. Their rival trade unions failed, and they just kind of lost their connections they had with the existing powers. But either way, like any way you want to look at the third period, for the CPGB, it was a flop. But despite this, they did have one success, and that was the National Unemployed Workers Movement, led by Wall Hannington. They organised these hunger marches in London, and apparently they met up in Hyde Park. They had about 100,000 people there. And the mainstream would do its, usual shtick of calling everything like a red plot funded with Bolshevik gold. And that's because communists had become an easy way of ignoring normal working class men, who during the Great Depression at this time, in the Hunger March, their families were starving. And so the police completely suppressed this whole march. They confiscated the petition, 70,000 officers were set on them, it was violent, it got out of hand, 75 people were seriously injured, and several leaders of the NUWM were imprisoned. So even after all of this, it wasn't enough to spark a communist revolution in Britain.
In this climate of bitterness, Hitler rose to prominence. A gifted public speaker, he captured the people's disillusionment with a series of speeches calling for a stronger, unified Germany.
When Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, the Communist International just dropped the third period. That was gone. It's old news now. Guys, you remember when we were saying that socialists are also fascists? No? Well done, comrade. You have learned quickly. New season's out, new release. This is now the Popular Front. Basically, the long and short of it, if you're anti-fascist, we're homies now. In 1932 in England, we would see the rise of the British Union of Fascists. I made a whole video about Oswald Mosley. You can check that out. I put it in the thing. For the story arc of the CPGB, this was perfect. This was now their arch nemesis. And it was time to go to war. The CPGB managed to rebuild its name by going to war against fascists. This somehow proved more popular than calling Labour fascists. And like, look, this isn't just the bros arguing on Twitter. These people were having battles in the street. There was the famous Cable Street battle in 1936. They were infiltrating the fascist meetings. They were disrupting them. They even went abroad and fought in battles. And so after completely tearing themselves down like 2 or 3 times previously, the CPGB finally got back up on its feet and said, it's time.
This introduces Mr. Harry Pollitt, General Secretary of the Communist Party.
So a short while before, in 1929, Harry Pollitt became the leader of the CPGB. This move was loved by the USSR. Stalin himself gave him his direct approval. Mate, honestly, Pollitt was just a Stalin stan. He absolutely bummed Stalin. Like, Stalin could do no wrong. When Stalin murdered all of his political opponents in the Moscow trials, Pollitt said, I think he was right. When Pollitt's personal friend called Rose Cohen, and by friend I mean a woman he'd proposed to a number of times but had friend-zoned him, when she, presumably a communist, was put on trial in the Great Purge in 1937 by Stalin, where he killed people, including the original revolutionaries that started the whole communist thing, Pollitt and the CPGB opposed Britain's intervention to try and protect her and save her, basically just saying what happens in Russia stays in Russia. And like, there was a number of British communists that were over in Moscow being arrested, tortured, shot, or just imprisoned in the gulag during Stalin's purge. And beyond Pollitt, I think this was a culture within the CPGB to just sort of deny any wrongdoing from the USSR. There was a lady called Rosa Rust, who was the daughter of William Rust, who was a journalist for the CPGB's Daily Worker newspaper. His daughter was shipped off to Kazakhstan at the age of 16, forced to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week, shoveling copper. She spent 3 years in this, but eventually she managed to escape and get out of there. And apparently when William Ross reunited with her, they just chose to never speak about that. Just, what's done is done. And William Ross would remain a Soviet communist loyalist until his death. So what I'm trying to paint the picture of is that these communist stands were basically USSR till I fucking drop dead, mate. But you see, it would be in 1939 where everything would change for the CPGB.
Adolf Hitler's all-out attack on Poland makes the long-dreaded European war a certainty. Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain gave the Nazi dictator a 0 hour for withdrawing his troops from Poland. That 0 hour ends now.
Mate, World War II was a head fuck for the CPGB, to say the least. When the Second World War began in 1939, Pollitt, very surprisingly, as he was still getting high off of that anti-fash stuff that helped them very recently, Pollitt actually cheered on Britain going to war against the Nazis. But Moscow wasn't so chuffed about that. Pollitt, I believe you misspoke. What do you mean? I thought we didn't like the fascists, right? I thought that was the whole thing we just did. No, Pollitt, you must have missed the letter. Communist International required Pollitt to resign in 1939. He was no longer leader because now the USSR, who were just deeply anti-fascist 2 minutes ago, now they would chill with the Nazis because, capitalism, imperialism and stuff. Obviously, very shortly after Pollitt said what he said, he didn't become some maverick trying to change the system. No, he denounced himself. He said that, what I said was wrong. So CPGB adopted another Communist International policy because that always worked out very well for them, which was called revolutionary defeatism, which meant that somehow, by Britain losing the war to the Nazis, that would create a communist revolution. And so obviously the government at the time, they weren't so stoked about the communists now. They went and banned their newspaper called the Daily Worker, because it was on the side of the enemy. And they had a reasonable fear that because of their power over the working class, which made up a lot of the soldiers, they didn't want them to undermine the war effort, and so they banned it. And then, of course, Germany invades the Soviet Union, and so the Soviets respond by saying, Hitler, we've always hated that guy. We teamed up with them as a gag. We were doing a bit. Oh my God, so now Harry Pollitt, who had said that what he'd said was wrong, now was put back in charge. He was right all along, but I assume he was never right. He was still wrong. You just have to stop thinking. Why are you trying to work it out? And so Harry Pollitt put on his favorite pair of flip-flops and took charge of the CPGB again. Your boy Pollitt was back in the driving seat. It was about to be a red boy summer. But you see, surprisingly, this Communist International constant switch-up that kept happening, it started to cause some divides amongst the communists. And it led to the dissolution of the Communist International. Most people interpret the dissolution as a move by Stalin to kind of try and show some good faith to America and Britain. It was like a gesture of goodwill. Like, guys, if we team up, then I'll stop telling all your working class people to kill you. After World War II, in Britain, we had an election straight after and everything changed. The Labour sentiment was strong, this united working class who just died in the most awful war to protect our country and democracy at large. Now, don't worry about how the establishment a few years ago was calling you all lazy for being unemployed during the Great Depression. Now we love the working class. They're great guys. So are the earth, I'd say. Russia and Britain were now homies. They were hanging out. Like, we'd even draw cute pictures and send it to each other. So post-World War II, the complete fear of communism had taken a back seat. We weren't as skeptical as we were before. And so the CPGB saw this as their time to try and gain some influence. They wanted to team up with Labour. However, Labour rejected the CPGB's effort to try and team up due to their previous anti-war position during World War II. This didn't stop the CPGB. In 1945, during the election, Harry Pollitt would pursue a progressive majority strategy. Rather than putting forward the 50 candidates they were originally gonna, they put forward 21 to make it easier for Labour to win. Labour said, bro, please stop fucking messaging me. This is getting weird now. And whatever. Basically, Harry Pollitt didn't win his seat. He got very close and the CPGB only won 2 seats. But despite not really that amazing of an election result, the CPGB was at the height of its influence.
Moscow heads the communist world in mourning the passing of Joseph Stalin. Anxiously, the world waits for the name of the new Soviet dictator.
In 1953, Stalin died. This moment didn't have a massive effect on the CPGB's popularity, but it would be a later moment, a speech called the Secret Speech, given by Nikita Khrushchev, that wasn't that secret, where he would denounce the atrocities committed by Stalin. It was horrifying. The things they found out during the secret speech that were previously not well known or reported, it sent shockwaves around the world. So at this point, the CPGB had a choice. Either we denounce Stalin, a dead man who did terrible things, or we don't do that. And they chose the second one of those options. And from here, mate, it was downhill. More and more shit kept happening. Nikita Khrushchev was giving money to the CPGB. He would, do a little secret annual donation of £100,000. But it would be the Warsaw Pact's crushing of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution that would cause the greatest loss in CPGB membership ever. What had happened is in 1948, the communists had taken control of the secret police. When the people of Hungary heard Khrushchev's not-so-secret speech, they tried to overthrow the Communist Party. Khrushchev didn't like that. They sent thousands of Soviet tanks and soldiers to just crush the protesters. Many were killed, many were arrested. The USSR just squashed this. It was a horrible moment, but the CPGB sided with the USSR. After this, in 1956, 1/4 to about 1/3 of the party quit, including many of the intellectuals and the artists who were communists back when it was mysterious and cool, and it was cool to put in your Tinder bio. Things weren't looking good for the Communist Party of Great Britain. From 1956 onward, honestly, it was just this slow, long, drawn-out death of the party. And like, the long and the short of it is that they just kept siding with the bad guys every time. And this would cause rifts within the party. There would be like British people saying, how about we just, you know, do it a little different to Moscow? We don't have to follow everything they... No! This reached another crisis in 1968 when the Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia. The CPGB had a choice to make here, you know, and they were very aware of how their response to the Hungary situation affected them. And so this time, they gave the most milquetoast criticisms of Moscow. They didn't refer to the invasion as an invasion and instead called it a intervention, but mostly they just reiterated the fact they loved the USSR. And it just got worse and worse. All the years of spying revealed a lot about the party, showing how they would very often take money from the Soviet Union. Harry Pollitt from 1933 to 1939 was in direct communication with Moscow, secretly, and he was considered their code holder. During these communications, Pollitt was basically told he should refute any news that was leaked about Stalin's purge. And the party would wreck themselves, you know, there was constant infighting, but somehow they held on. You know, they had some stragglers right up until 1991. Just in their wheelchairs, old and grey, just saying, the communist revolution's coming, guys, I'm sure. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the party had a come-to-Jesus moment and realised, let's just give up, lads. It's done. But there were still scandals that would just keep being uncovered as time would go on.
Where's my money? You gonna give me my money? Where's my money, man?
Ironically, the CPGB had assets worth somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million pounds, which for people that don't believe in the concept of money is pretty good. Most of it was tied up in properties that the party owned. They bought them back when it was cheap to buy in London, and over time it had appreciated in value. When the CPGB dissolved, these assets landed in the hand of a new organisation called Unlock Democracy. One of the members of this organisation, called Stuart Hill, he gave a quote about what happened to the headquarters of the Communist Party. He said that the headquarters of the old Communist Party was sold to a bullion dealer. Ironically, if you wanted to make it up, you couldn't. Bullion is a raw material that you mine. Mining, the miners' strike, communist. It's funny, you get it, okay? Come on. And I mean, in just the most poetic of all ironies, the original Communist Party headquarters became a HSBC bank in the middle of a busy shopping district.
Communist Party has arrived, Cambridge, here and all across the globe. Get involved with us if you know that capitalism's had its day.
Communism in Britain died. Yeah, there are a few very small, irrelevant parties, and I know some people will make the claim that they have influence through academia, films, and stuff like this, but let's be honest, in the era of privatization, austerity, social budgets being completely slashed, we are so far from anything close to communism. So it leads me to sort of wonder, why did communism not take off in England? And I think what it was is that the conditions here were different to other countries where it did happen. Mainly being that here we had a strong labour movement, and we've had a history of democracy and parliament, different groups gaining a voice in the ruling class that has existed for a long time. We have this as a tradition. And I think that what happened was that Labour were able to do just enough to stop it from happening. After World War II, there was what was known as the post-war consensus. And this led to things like the welfare state, the National Health Service, social security, public housing, expansions of education and social services that helped integrate the working class into the political and social mainstream. These reforms reduced the main problem that the communists had, which was the deep social inequalities. It massively improved living standards for everyone. And so basically, if the government's helping you get a roof over your head, taking care of you when you're ill, probably your hunger to cut off the rich people's heads starts to go down a little bit. And so that was it. Communism was defeated, fascism was defeated in Britain. And I'm proud that for a period of time we never went down any radical ideologies. Although, very quietly and very secretly, a radical new ideology would appear in the 80s that would completely take over Britain with the rise of neoliberalism.
Her response to this economic instability was a simple one. The free market would get us out of this jam, but to free the market, we have to destroy the post-war consensus and suppress labor unions who are restricting the market with pesky inefficiencies like workers' rights.
Boys, make sure you jump on the Discord. I'm going to be doing loads of live streams researching this neoliberalism video, so you'll be the first to know and you can help me make this video. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.